Welcome back to the Registries Revealed podcast from Kyckr. I'm Steve, and over the next 30 minutes, we're going to be deep diving into another company registry. After covering the UK Companies House last time round, we're drilling straight through the centre of the earth to the land where the sinks run backwards. That's right, I'm talking about Australia, and I'll be joined by my Antipodean friend, Alex Beck. Alex is a company data and product specialist who has spent nearly 15 years building services that help regulated entities to verify, understand and investigate Australian companies. We talk about the difference between the ASIC, ABR and PPSR registries. Alex would know, as he built a market-leading beneficial ownership product on top of them. Next, we go through the Australian government's Modernising Business Registers programme, whether the current registries deliver a poor digital system, as an independent review recently claimed, or whether Australia deserves praise for its vast data and various access methods. We'll also be talking about one of our favourite topics on the pod, beneficial ownership, and whether we can expect to see a public register in Australia anytime soon, or if international stories like the 2022 CJEU judgment in Europe, that again, are generating caution. Finally, there's the role of information brokers in the Australian registry system, another area that Alex is qualified to talk about, as he's worked for two of them, Equifax, and as of summer 2024, Kyckr, as our new head of product. So we're keeping it in the family this week, but with someone who undoubtedly knows their stuff. I'll be back for some reflections at the end, and to also let you know how you can get involved with the podcast. For now, let's get into it. So Alex, welcome, and thank you for joining us on the show. You're someone who's spent almost 15 years immersed in the world of Australian registries. So tell us, how did you first become involved in working with registry data?
Well, that was back in 2012 post PPSR. So PPSR is actually where I got started, not actually in the company's register, but AFSA, Australian Financial Securities Authority, removed the ASIC charges from the company's register and created a new register. So that separation got me focused on PPSR, but then I had the idea of stitching PPSR back into the company extract, which, human needs don't change, and that's what our customers expected, just one report to get both. So that's how I indirectly got into it.
And on our last episode, we talked about UK's business register, Companies House, an executive agency of the UK government. You're someone clearly who's seen a lot of change in that time. Is there now a single registry in Australia? How does the system differ?
Well, there is a single companies register, but there's multiple registers across the business landscape. So I first have to introduce ASIC, Australia's Security and Investments Commission. So we regard them as the operator of a suite of business registers. And that's mandated in the Corporations Act 2001.
Okay, what role does ASIC play then in business registration?
Well, they operate the registers. So those registers consist of business names registers, companies registers, professional registers, and they form that official source of legal entities in Australia. To give you a sense of scale, there's about 3.2 million companies on that register, and there's 2.7 million business names. They're both heavily used, and ASIC's the operator of that register. It has been the main operator of that register since 1991.
And we've talked before, and we were talking before the record about the ABR, so the Australian Business Register. Talk to us about that. Is that something that's separate from ASIC? Is it operated by the same body? And what role does that perform?
Yeah, so whilst ASIC operates the company and business names register, the Australian Tax Office, the ATO, operates the Australian Business Register, the ABR, we call it for short. And they also now operate director IDs. So as a tax function, the ABR is about entities, all types of legal entities, including sole traders, people conducting a business. But it's really about that type of entity. There's 250 types of entities on that register, as well as, when they started that business and GST, so goods and services tax. Does that entity, is it required or allowed to collect GST?
I was going to ask you what types of businesses register with the various registries. Given there's 250 types, we maybe won't go into quite so much detail on that. But I think some of our listeners will be wondering, particularly those working on business verification and gathering data from the registries, how do you know which register to find a company in?
Yeah, so most of the information brokers have got around this slightly fragmented system. And so you can go into an entity search for the purposes of just verifying an entity. And typically, an entity isn't just presented with a single name. In Australia, we would say we've got a company, ABC Proprietary Limited, with an ACN 123123124, the company number, trading as a business name. And it can get more complex. It could be as a corporate trustee of a trust. So when you ask a simple question, you think we're just going to go and identify a single entity, like a name of a company. It's never been that simple. And so what happens is a user might start with the ABNs, probably the best search strategy. And the ABN in a system that's parallel hitting these three registers can return pretty much all the information you need, and that'll summarize it into one response. So it'll say for that ABN, there'll be a match for the ACN and return the company, and it'll typically return the business names. If you don't have all of that information, then you're slightly challenged. For example, if you've just got a business name, the business name register reveals who the proprietor is behind that business name, which could be a company. The ABR reveals who the business names are registered to that ABN.
That's quite unique. Actually, if we look at the global landscape, to have a register that lists out the business names, but actually draws the linkages to the companies behind them as well.
Yeah, so that's the business name extract. It came about in about 2012, replacing unregistered trading names. So all the registries have a very succinct and simple purpose. It's really allowing anyone with the need to work out who the legal entity is behind the trading name and business name, and then who the people are behind the legal entity if it's a company, heading to the company register. A trust are another matter, of course.
And we've started to talk a little bit then about some of the different types of information that are available at the registers. Just give us a bit of an overview of what I can expect as someone working in financial crime. What are the types of information that I can get?
So I've already alluded to what's behind the ABR, not a lot, and business names is pretty succinct. But I think the most interesting register then is the company's register. And so let me just summarize that. If you've got a proprietary company, you typically want to know one of three things. Most people are only sort of focused on the first question, which is who are the people behind the business and the shareholders behind the company, and that's the company extract. But if you're starting with the director and you wanted to know what are all the companies that the person is a director of, that's a personal name browse and extract. And then if you wanted to know what are the roles of a company, that's a relational extract where that can reveal that a company is a director or a shareholder of other companies. So even though the register's been built in 1991 and it's running on a mainframe, it's got those three directional searches that we all need to start with. Anyone can go in any sort of relational direction. Within the company extract, you've got obviously the key details, the status of the company. That's incredibly important. What people usually look for is how long has the company been in business? When did it register? There's an annual renewal date that companies have to pay a fee, and if they don't pay their fee, they're going to be subject to strike off. So people look at that renewal date, and companies have to express to ASIC that they're still a going concern. If they're not a going concern within 2 months of that renewal date, the status, of course. And then we get into, the directors of the business, the office holders of the companies, and then we get into the share structures and the membership of that share structures. And that's all quite useful information for multiple purposes.
We're going to talk a little bit later about ultimate beneficial ownership and what the situation is there in Australia. But it sounds to me like actually there's quite a lot that can be done with the information that's in the extracts alone. If you're dealing with reasonably extensive shareholder information, you can do your director search, relational extracts. It sounds like there's quite a decent picture you could build up of a shareholding structure and real ownership from that alone.
Absolutely. I mean, when you look at the submissions on the beneficial ownership register, they don't pay respect to the solutions that the information brokers have built and how the current, market's operating. And so what the submissions on the first round sort of pointed out, and I knew this having built a solution that does this, is that, for 80% of the use cases, you can automate determination of who the likely beneficial owner is based on the share structure, the members of the share structure, even across complex multi-company ownership. There's obviously challenges with that though, but it's a 20%, not an 80%.
Yeah. And you've mentioned these information brokers a few times. So they clearly seem quite important to how information is distributed and how users can access the registries. What are the information brokers, and are they the only way you can access the information, or are there other ways as well?
I think if you go back prior to 2012, ASIC was pretty much only accessible through information brokers from a search perspective, and that subsequently changed with ASIC Connect. And the reason why I frame it like that is when the PPS Act introduced the Personal Property Security Register, what was new about that was that they were going to go direct, the government was going to go direct to business and consumer. And so that meant that the information brokers couldn't just be a conduit, they had to add value. And so the information brokers, there are in excess of 10 information brokers. And I think what they do, the purpose that they serve is they make the most of the current registry landscape, and they focus on the user problems to be solved, which is usually, high volume commercial lending across all the different legal entity types, and how can we reduce credit risk or AML risk and extend funds efficiently in an increasingly digital economy.
Well, we should probably say for full disclosure that Kyckr is one of those information brokers. So we've worked very closely with ASIC on that point. And yeah, I mean, to me, again, looking at the global field, it is quite a unique relationship where you've got the private sector very clearly partnering with the government department in this case to understand how they can build effective tools and products on top of the data. And I wonder if it speaks again to ASIC's role, not only as the registry, but also as the regulator. And, having that need to foster good practice across the sector and the ecosystem. Because as you say, it's one thing having the data, but it's got to be in a usable format. So there's clearly a very important role there for those brokers and wider providers.
Yeah, I was just going to say that ASIC and the company's register, for example, will focus on the establishment of companies in Australia, but Austrac's regulating the AML requirements. And then so you've got all these registers, all these laws, and it all comes down to regulated entities and how they interpret and act upon all of that and how effective they are. And so that's really the adaptive, innovative role of the information brokers in the market. And Kyckr in this space is obviously focused on that cross-border problem. So how can we work with the Australian information brokers and help their solutions get past the Australian boundary and move into the international ownership space?
What are some of the other types of information or ways of you can access information from the registries as well? So we talked about information brokers. You've mentioned a couple of times ASIC Connect. Do you want to just briefly talk about what that is?
ASIC Connect's a public available website that anyone can go on and search and buy a company extract for $10 to reveal, for example, who the directors are behind your building company if you've got a dispute with them. So outside of that, I mean, the PPSR is also another publicly available website that people will go and search on typically to work out whether a car is encumbered by a financier. But there are use cases where you have to go to a information broker. So if I want to do a personal name, browse an extract on a director, that's behind the onboarding process of an information broker and then behind the paywall.
So quite a sophisticated set of access protocols then, it sounds like, ranging from brokers to a public access website. But you mentioned earlier that the registries have existed, in some technical form since 1991, which is a long time in the world of technology. In 2019, the Australian government announced something called the Modernising Business Registers or MBR program. Just tell us some more about that and maybe what the outcome's been as well.
Yeah, so the Modernising Business Registers program, I mean, prior to that, one should know that in 2016, ASIC was looking to privatise the register. Then with the MBR program, to call it for short, that saw the ownership of that to the ATO. And so it's interesting, right? It sort of indicates that ASIC, for some reason, doesn't want to be the long-term maintainer of the operator of the business register. But that said, it's now gone back to ASIC. So the MBR program, if I was to say one good thing, two good things came out of it. One is the recognition that we should, in a digital economy, we need a modern register. And the other good thing that came out of it was we've now got a director ID that AFRS, Australian Business Registry Services, ABRS, operates. And so all directors are required to have a director ID. And to get a director ID, you have to go through a digital identity, government digital identity program, basically requiring a passport and a driver's license, but interestingly, not necessarily proof of life. The mainframe infrastructure investment sort of got paused whilst $2 billion was invested in the MBR program. Originally, it was meant to be $500 million. And then it was stopped because it was going to cost another $2 billion to complete. So now what we've got ASIC owning the registry again and requiring investment. They're calling that a Registry Connect program. And that's got some really important short-term goals.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like, on the one hand, some really good stuff's come out of that. And you talked about the director ID. Very interestingly, very clear parallels to the UK and what we were talking about on last time's show around the work the UK is doing on implementing IDV there. I mean, on the other hand, I had a review of the independent review report that came out when looking at the MBR this year, and it described the current registry system as an aged service delivering a poor digital experience, which generates uncertainty, rework, and unnecessary cost for business. I mean, pretty excoriating. Do you think that's a fair criticism?
Not necessarily, because that process has been the same for so long. It's probably been one of the most stable parts of the most stable registry in the history of the last 30 years. I think everyone's got used to operating with that register. So from all of the agents that support the companies in their compliance requirements, which I don't think are particularly onerous, and then all the information brokers are innovated around any of the constraints. And it's actually an incredibly high throughput register that can support bulk AML remediations. And the APIs are incredibly well structured and fielded, and the data's rich. It's probably more a question of we are in a modern digital economy, and we have higher expectations of identity verification of the people's names that appear on these registries, which doesn't occur. So that's where I think directionally that's the room for improvement. But even though we've got the director's ID, there's no connection. You don't need to give your director's ID to ASIC. So that's some of the opportunities going forward.
Yeah, it sounds like it could be an expectations problem and continually striving for excellence, as you said, because we work with global registries every single day, 300 of them, in fact. And to describe, ASIC as an aged service compared to some of the registries that we deal with, I'd say it's pretty good. Describe it as delivering a poor digital experience, well, of course it could be better and there's aspects of it, but again, it's stable. It offers good API access, good bulk data. So, it's interesting that the government are setting such high standards, right? And looking to invest in, albeit not quite as much as it was initially planned, in improving the customer experience, in this case, the customer being the general public, journalists, businesses. And we touched then on identity verification around directors. And one thing our listeners are always asking me, and we touched in the last show, is around verification of the business data and how much that should be trusted. So in your knowledge, Alex, how much verification is done of the actual company details that are on the register?
So the company details in a company extract on the register, just to be clear, is operators hand key that in off the submitted PDFs. So if you talk to an insolvency practitioner, they would just say, look, that company extract is just your starting point. And if you want to know more, you got to go into the submitted documents. So then in terms of validation of that information, I mean, there's laws and penalties around timing and accuracy, right? But all that said, I think everyone just has got used to this mental model, which is probably different to where the UK is going of, and we'll probably go in that direction. But at the moment, it's really just a notice board. And the notice board, in my mind, in the total landscape solves the right problem because it just says, who are the legal entities that are active? What's the status that they're active, and who are the people behind the business? When I say people behind the company, like a director or a shareholder that's potentially a beneficial owner, it might be, in a case of a director, it's a name, date of birth, and address, and a shareholder, it's just a name and address. Now, it's not until you've got someone that showed up at a bank asking to open a bank account or any regulated protected service. It's at that point of the bank doing that identity verification. That's when you finally connect that supposed name, Alex Beck, at the company register to, now I've got the real person, a living person, and that's who I'm going to hold accountable for the actions done under the auspices of that company.
Your advice is treat it as a notice board then, but still work to be done in terms of verification of the data that exists there.
Yeah, that's right. So long as everyone knows that, that's great. I think the AML framework sort of says collect from the company, your beneficial owners, your directors, etc., and then verify that against an independent second source. And so they do that with a company registered here in Australia. And then if we get a beneficial ownership register, then FATF is just saying, well, they're not saying drop one, they're saying do all three. So then it becomes a question of, well, what problem are we solving if we're doing all three? And there's answers to that because the registers, I said, is 80% okay. 20% of the time, there's nominee shareholders and or the company's a corporate trustee of a trust, and then the trust is hiding the settlers and beneficiaries, and then you need to get the trust. And so the more complex a legal entity structure gets, the more complex it is for the bank, the more costly it is for the bank to do the risk-based assessment. And, ultimately the legal entity that was trying to hide their identity doesn't, and it just costs them more to get on board, is how I think about it.
So let's move on to UBOs then. I mean, you mentioned there around beneficial ownership and finding out the real owners of the company. What plans are there for Australia to have its own beneficial ownership register?
Well, so the second draft and call for submissions from the interested public, that's just focused on listed entities, which is in the thousands, not the 3.2 million companies. So it's focused on a highly regulated small group of listed entities that are on balance far less likely to be actors of money laundering. But certainly that when I read that submission, it gave great clarity about how to calculate beneficial ownership, and it's based on control, voting rights, and they're tracking 5% and 1% increments, 1% changes. They acknowledge it. That's a great initiative, I think, but they also acknowledge it's just the first step, and it's a much smaller step and a big pullback from what the original proposal was, and the original proposal probably had a lot of pushback.
So we should clarify for listeners then. So Australia has had a commitment to launching a beneficial ownership register for a number of years now, or there's been debate around that for a long time. So November 14th, the consultation you mentioned was launched on draft amendments to the Corporations Act. No timeline yet, no date, so to speak, of when this might be launched. We did some research on this before and just looked at some of the public commentary around this. And it does seem like the Albanese government is committed to increasing transparency of beneficial ownership, whether or not that leads to a full public register anytime soon. One hand, nothing's happened yet. And it is a bit of an outlier, Australia, when we look at some of the major Western economies in terms of having access to beneficial ownership data. On the other hand, there seems at least to be an ongoing commitment under the current government to do something about that.
Yeah, I think one has to look at the submissions to the first round and figure out why it's been reduced in scope. And so what was the first submission? The first submission was 3.2 million private companies are all of a sudden going to have to keep a public register up to date. Now, that's a huge burden on your typical mum and dad company. And by the way, they would have had to have answered the beneficial ownership question when they got a bank account. The information brokers have already solved this problem for 80% of the time, which 80% of the time, the share structure is at ASIC and the members of the share structure are beneficially held. There's no trusts involved. And even if it's multi-company, which used to be a complexity that, risk-based, you sometimes wouldn't do it and sometimes you would, and you'd be hand calculating it in or calculate it in Excel. We all automated that. I mean, Equifax or Vita at the time automated that with the company beneficial ownership report, and then other information brokers have since followed. So what problem do we really need to solve? And for years, we've just been calling out two things. One is trusts and transparency of trusts and beneficiaries behind trusts. So, ideally phase 2 would be, after listed entities, would be trusts. So aside from the trust issue, then there's this, well, why does ASIC allow you to have nominee share ownership via this beneficially held flag? And I actually think this flag at ASIC, there's probably some errors in people incorrectly setting that flag in terms of registering on the company register. And then in terms of search, there's probably people not understanding the importance of that flag and how their workflow needs to be different. And they need to work out, actually get actual share registry ownership and work out who these nominees are holding the shares on behalf of. So if we could tackle those two problems via some form of and it will be determined by ASIC and not public, it should be accessible by regular entities for that purpose. Because that example I give of who is the director of the home builder that's done a shoddy job and I need to take him to Department of Fair Trading, I need that information. But as a member of the public, do I need to know who the beneficial owner is? I personally don't think so. Certainly not just public and free.
Well, there's been, again, what came up in the research was there's been some definite impact and waves from the 2022 CJEU judgment, which came up in our first podcast. I imagine is going to come up a few more times now in terms of the impact on global transparency around beneficial ownership data. So maybe that is a factor, and perhaps some of the other cases we've seen globally that has led to a gradual shrinking of the scope.
Yeah, everyone I talk to, it's really moving to a regulated entity is definitely needed. Why does the public need it is to be determined.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we've got a really clear picture on the registries, how they work, different ways of accessing the information. Alex, again, you're someone with lots of experience in the Australian market, working with regulated businesses, businesses that need to verify entities, do deep investigations on them for a variety of reasons. What are your top tips for companies that need to verify companies based in Australia?
Oh, the tips, there's the entity verification step. Let's just talk about that for a second. So you can come up with complexities where the client gives you what they thought was the correct information, but they haven't necessarily registered their totality of legal entity structure with the registers correctly. So I'll just give you an example. Let's say I start under a business name, Beck's Mowing or Beck's Landscaping, and I start as a sole trader and my ABN's of the sole trader. And then I decide to create a company structure because I'm going to create a landscaping business, but it's still called Beck's Mowing and I've still got the ABN of the sole trader. And then I've got an ACN and a company name is Beck's Landscaping Services, New South Wales Proprietary Limited, that I'm not going to tell anyone that name. And so then I present to the bank and I want to open a bank account. And so I've presented this information and now they're burdened with verifying if this is all correct. And they can't connect the ABN to the ACN. The ABN leads them to a sole trader. The sole tradership leads me to the business name. So I can open the business name as a sole trader, but I can't open the bank account as a company. So getting all that wrong is sort of, well, why are people getting that wrong? Well, because the landscape in Australia is a bit disconnected. And so I think that's the opportunity going forward to fix that. So until that gets fixed at the registries, then that's what you got to watch out for. But, top tip is start with the ABN, confirm at the ABR that the business name is presented to help by that individual, and the ABN links to the ACN. And then you can get to the company extract and confirm that that individual's a director and has the ability to sign contracts.
And maybe that's time for a shameless plug. Not that we planned it this way, but your team's done some really interesting work actually at Kyckr in chaining together some of those searches. So actually, yes, we're dealing with a slightly fragmented market, but we can allow users to do one search and actually query those different registries and pull back the totality of what information is available. So, it's not just Kyckr. There are other businesses out there, but there is definitely scope for innovation, bringing together and aggregating some of those different data sources.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the role information brokers are serving, and I'm sure we can do more.
Well, that's the perfect place to wrap up then, Alex. I want to thank you for your time. Lots of interesting insights. We'll be back again in a couple of weeks' time.
Thank you for having me, Steve. It was awesome.
So, we're 2 episodes in and already hearing some of the major differences that exist then between the world's corporate registries. That said, I think one of the similarities that stands out between Australia's system and the Companies House in the UK is that there's clearly a strong drive to improve the services and data that are offered by the respective registries. As always, the public will judge governments by results. Pretty staggering to hear just how the budget for the MBR programme has ballooned, and the sense that the ambition had been quite radically scaled back, along with some of the uncertain outcomes regarding the beneficial ownership register. So I'll maybe leave you with a question rather than an answer on that one, which is under which government department or agency should a corporate registry sit? Sounds like the question may not be fully answered yet, at least as far as Australia is concerned, but maybe something we can dig into for the other countries we'll be covering. Hit the description for some of the documents Alex and I mentioned in this call, particularly if you're interested in the MBR programme outcomes. That said, there were some thorny acronyms that got covered in our interview: ASIC, ABR, PPSR, MBR. So if you'd like a more general introduction to the registry, I'd strongly encourage you to read Kyckr's Guide to the Australian Registries, which will be available on our website this week. Link to come in the description on that one as well. I mentioned in my intro as well that there are some ways you can get involved with the podcast, and that is we want to know which registries to cover next. If you've got any requests or any questions for that matter, please send them in. You can do so by reaching out to us via the Kyckr LinkedIn page or by emailing info@kyckr.com. Best questions to be read out each episode. Thanks again to Alex Beck for his great insights, and we'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. For now, I'm off to eat a Vegemite sandwich.